caught in a deadly trap. Will he choose to save her on a dying planet? What if everything you thought you knew about love was wrong? What if love didn't start in your heart, but somewhere far beyond the stars? Could you fall for a being from another world, when everything you are, everything you believe, is built on the ground you stand on? On a night that seemed ordinary, I received a message. It wasn't from anyone I knew. It wasn't even from someone human. The message came from somewhere no one had ever been. No one but her. And it pulled me into a world that I never thought possible, a world that isn't bound by time, or space, or logic. The moment I heard her voice, I knew something inside me had changed forever. But here's the question no one asks: can we love something that's not us? Something that isn't even from this planet? If love crosses galaxies, can we still call it love? Or is it a disaster waiting to happen? You'll want to watch this till the very end, because this story is about to challenge everything you think you know. Are you ready to find out what love really means? The planet Andorion was unlike any world Ethan had ever seen. Twin suns hovered above, bathing the land in a constant, fiery glow. The sky never darkened. Not like Earth. The days stretched on, endless and scorching. Heat radiated from the ground, waves of air shimmered like the surface of boiling water. And yet, despite the relentless blaze, the world was eerily silent. Nothing seemed to move, nothing except the dust that floated lazily in the still air. Ethan stood at the edge of a vast canyon, his boots scraping against the sun-baked stone. His fingers twitched on the sensor pad, but his eyes were focused on something far beyond the distant relay tower. He wasn't looking at it, not really. He was looking through it, through the orange haze, through the heavy dust clouds that hung like a constant veil. He didn't know what he was waiting for, but he could feel it. Deep in his chest, a quiet tension had settled, something he couldn't shake. It had been 12 days since he last spoke to another human. 12 days since the cargo hauler dropped him here with a 6-week repair order and a corporate message that, while not outright saying he was expendable, made it clear. He liked it that way. Alone. Simple. Efficient. Safe. He was here to fix solar relays. To keep the grid online long enough for the survey ship to finish its mapping. A few weeks of work, then he would be back to the core worlds. That was the plan. But now, standing on the edge of this alien world, Ethan had begun to feel something shift. A sound broke through the silence. A thin, high-pitched cry. At first, he thought it was the wind, a whistle through the rocks. But then it came again, sharp, desperate, not the wind. Not the weather. A sound of pain. His spine stiffened, and for a moment, he stood frozen. His instincts screamed at him to ignore it. This wasn't his problem. It wasn't his job. But his legs moved anyway, taking him toward the cry. The canyon's edge was steep, the ground cracked and uneven beneath his boots. He carefully navigated the jagged stone, his eyes scanning the horizon. The air shimmered as heat waves distorted the view. He could taste the bitterness of the minerals in the air, the metallic tang of dust. The cry returned. It was broken now, strained, like the last thread of hope, fraying at the edges. Ethan's heart raced. He shouldn't be here. He had a job to do. But something in him, something deep, urged him on. His feet carried him down the narrow gully, past sharp rocks and thorned plants that coiled in the heat. The world was suffocating, and yet, there was something more, something beneath the surface that felt wrong. Then he saw it. A figure. A tangle of limbs, blood-dark smears on the stone. He froze. It wasn't an animal, not like anything he'd ever seen. Suspended in a crude trap, her body curled in agony, was a woman. Not human, no. She had blue skin that shimmered faintly, iridescent like the surface of a storm-tossed ocean. Her eyes, wide, silver with glowing vertical slits. Alien. Yet, beautiful in a way he couldn't explain. Her hair, long and green, clung to her sweat-slick skin as she struggled. Her body twisted awkwardly, one leg caught in the trap, blood running down her side. Ethan felt a pang of something unfamiliar. Fear. Compassion. He didn't know. He stepped closer. She flinched at his movement, her body jerking in pain, but her eyes never left him. Not wild, not begging, just watching. Calculating. Easy, he murmured, his voice low, unsure. She made no sound, but her eyes seemed to understand. His hands worked quickly, scanning the trap. Military grade, old, definitely not designed for anything he'd seen on this planet. He took out his heat knife, the blade hissing as it sliced through the metal wire. She tensed at the sight of the knife, her fingers scraping at the trap's supports, trying to free herself. But she didn't scream. Didn't plead. She just watched. Finally, the last coil snapped. Her body collapsed into his arms, too weak to resist. Ethan caught her, his arms instinctively supporting her fragile form. She was light, but her body felt dense, almost unnatural. He adjusted his grip, shifting her weight, and began walking back to his camp. The path was treacherous, and the air was thick with dust. He could feel the heat rising again. He had to hurry. Every step felt like a weight pressing down on his chest. Something was different now. The world was no longer silent. The sense of isolation he'd felt before was gone. She was with him. A stranger. A being from another world. He glanced down at her. She was still breathing, shallow and fast, but her eyes were open, still watching him. Not afraid. Not trusting. Just studying. He looked ahead, the rugged terrain stretching out before him. His camp was a few kilometers east, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching them, waiting. As he walked, he felt an odd weight in his chest. Was it fear? Curiosity? Or something else? He didn't know. But he knew one thing. He wasn't alone anymore. The journey back to his camp felt longer than it was. Each step Ethan took, carrying the alien woman in his arms, weighed heavier than the last. Her body trembled slightly against his chest, her breathing shallow, but steady. Her skin felt cold against his own, as though her very presence was a shock to the system. Every movement of her sent ripples through his mind, like a strange melody played too close. Ethan kept his pace steady, eyes scanning the rocky cliffs surrounding them. He couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't alone. The silence of Andorian wasn't just empty. It was a presence, a watchful, waiting presence. He felt as if the planet itself was holding its breath, observing. The canyon walls were steep on either side, the path narrow and treacherous. He'd been here before, countless times, yet now, every crack in the stone, every gust of wind, felt like a warning. The air was thick with dust, and his breath felt tight, strained. He couldn't help but look down at the woman in his arms. Her eyes were still open, though unfocused. She blinked slowly, as if processing the strange sensation of being held. Her long green hair, damp with sweat, stuck to his chest. Her body was slight, fragile, but there was strength in the way she resisted the trap, the way she didn't scream. "Who are you?" he whispered under his breath, though he didn't expect an answer. Her silver eyes flicked toward him, catching his gaze with an intensity that made him pause. There was something in her expression, something not quite human. Her lips parted slightly, as though she were about to speak, but no sound came. Just a faint hum, like a distant echo in his mind. A shiver ran down his spine. Was she speaking to him? Or was this just the strange, silent language of her people? He adjusted his grip, feeling her weight shift in his arms. Despite the strangeness of it all, Ethan couldn't help but feel the pull between them. Her presence was magnetic, unsettling in the most unexpected way. He shook his head, pushing the thoughts aside. There was no room for distractions. Not now. As they neared his camp, the feeling of being watched intensified. He kept his eyes darting to the edges of the canyon, searching for movement in the shadows. The small, isolated base was just ahead. His rover sat there, a quiet sentinel against the red dust. The solar panels, half folded after a previous storm, barely gleamed in the harsh sunlight. It was nothing special, but it was home for now. He reached the entrance and activated the hatch with a flick of his wrist. The door slid open with a low hiss, and he stepped inside, still carrying her. The moment the door sealed behind them, the sense of something watching receded, but it didn't disappear. The interior of the rover was cold, starkly utilitarian. A narrow cot sat against the far wall, a small field medkit nearby. Ethan carefully lowered her onto the cot, his fingers brushing against her smooth skin as he set her down. For a moment, they both just existed in the quiet. The hum of the cooling systems filled the air, a reminder that the world outside was still as unforgiving as ever. Ethan turned to grab the medkit, but as he did, something caught his attention. The pendant around her neck, an iridescent shard of polished glass, glowed faintly in the dim light. It pulsed, like a heartbeat, but slower. His fingers brushed it lightly, causing her to flinch. Her eyes snapped to his, no longer unfocused but sharp and calculating. She wasn't afraid. She wasn't trusting him yet, but there was something familiar in the way she looked at him. "Easy," he murmured, pulling his hand back slowly. "I'm not here to hurt you." Her lips parted slightly, and the same soft hum filled the air, vibrating through the silence between them. Ethan's breath hitched. He didn't understand the language, but the feeling, the connection was undeniable. He knelt beside her, unpacking the medkit. Her leg, still bleeding, had deepened from the weight of her body. She winced as he cleaned the wound, her muscles stiffening, but she didn't resist. "I need to stop the bleeding," Ethan said, more to himself than to her, as he applied the gel sealant to her leg. Her skin was cool under his fingers, smoother than anything he'd ever felt. The touch was electric, sending a strange jolt through his chest. The silence stretched between them again, but this time, it was different. It wasn't awkward. It wasn't forced. It was understanding. Her silver eyes watched him, studying his every movement. There was something in them. Something that made him uneasy, but also, inexplicably, drawn to her. She wasn't like anyone he'd ever met. With a final sigh, he tightened the brace around her leg, making sure it was secure. "That should hold for now. You'll be fine." Her eyes softened, just for a moment, and then she let out a low, soft sound like a word, or maybe just a breath. Ethan blinked, unsure if he had imagined it. She was different. She wasn't human, but she was still a person. She needed help, and he wasn't going to turn his back on her. Ethan stepped back, his eyes still on her. "We'll figure this out," he said, though he wasn't sure who he was reassuring. As he settled into a seat across from her, he couldn't help but wonder, what had he just gotten himself into? And why did it feel like he wasn't alone anymore? The hours drifted by in the quiet of the rover, and still, Liora didn't speak. Not that Ethan had expected her to. But there was something in the silence that pulled at him. Her eyes never left him. Even as he busied himself with repairs, checking the equipment, cleaning the mess from the medkit, he could feel her gaze, steady, searching. It was unsettling. And yet, in some strange way, it was comforting. Ethan couldn't help but glance over at her now and then. Liora lay there, her leg bandaged, her body still but for the occasional shift, the twitch of her hand, a quiet breath. He couldn't stop thinking about her. Her alien features, her soft green hair, the way her eyes seemed to see right through him. He didn't know why it felt so natural to be near her. She wasn't human. But right now, with the dusty air outside and the looming isolation of Andorian, it didn't matter. "How are you feeling?" Ethan asked, turning to face her. Liora blinked slowly, her lips pressing together as though contemplating his words. She tried to move, her injured leg stiffening, and a low hiss of pain escaped her. Ethan was quick to step forward, his hands steady as he helped her adjust, making sure she didn't hurt herself further. She met his gaze again. There was something in her eyes. Something that made his chest tighten. "You're not, like the others, are you?" he asked softly, almost to himself. Liora's mouth parted, and for a fleeting moment, she hummed again, that low, melodic sound, as if speaking, but not. Ethan frowned. It was a sound he couldn't translate, couldn't quite understand, but it felt as if she were responding to something he wasn't asking aloud. Her gaze softened just slightly, and her lips curled into a faint smile. "Could you tell me your name?" Ethan asked, his voice hesitant. He had no reason to believe she would answer, but the question felt important. It was the only bridge between them. She blinked, once. Twice. Then she lifted her hand, her fingers trembling slightly as they reached for the pendant hanging around her neck. She tugged at it gently, her skin gleaming in the soft light, and Ethan found his eyes drawn to the object. It pulsed again, faint but steady, as though alive. Her finger hovered over the pendant before she finally placed it gently in her lap, looking up at him. Her voice, if it could be called that, came as a gentle vibration, almost imperceptible to his ears, but loud in his mind. "Liora." The word resonated in his thoughts, clear and unmistakable. Ethan's heart skipped a beat. It wasn't just a word. It was a connection, like a thread woven into his mind, pulling him closer to her. "Liora," he repeated, softly. He tested the sound on his tongue, a name that felt strangely familiar. He couldn't explain it, but there was a part of him that wanted to protect her. Wanted to keep her safe, no matter what. A loud thud suddenly echoed from outside the rover, followed by the deep rumble of what sounded like a distant engine. Liora's eyes snapped to the window, her body immediately alert, her muscles stiffening despite her injury. Ethan's heart raced. He hadn't expected any visitors. Not out here. Not this far from the main survey ship. He quickly moved to the viewport, squinting into the distance. A cloud of dust had kicked up, swirling in the hot air, obscuring most of the view. But the shape of a vehicle emerged slow, deliberate. Someone's out there, he muttered to himself, more to confirm it than ask a question. Liora shifted, trying to sit up despite her pain. Ethan hurried to her side, his hands gentle but firm. No. Stay still. You're hurt. Let me handle this. She froze, her eyes locking onto his, and for the first time, she seemed to understand the seriousness of the situation. Without a word, she nodded, settling back onto the cot. Ethan grabbed his rifle, checking the charge. It had been weeks since he'd needed it. Now, in the thick of this new, strange world, it seemed that he would need it sooner than expected. He moved quickly, taking position behind the rover's main console, peeking through the viewport. The vehicle was closer now. He could see the outline of a figure. Another scavenger? Or someone else? Then, he saw the insignia. It was unmistakable. The corporate logo of a mining company. The same one that had sent him here. His gut tightened. That meant one thing: trouble. Stay down, Ethan ordered, his voice low and steady. He didn't know if Liora understood the warning, but her eyes followed him as he positioned himself, rifle raised. There was a brief silence. And then, the hatch on the vehicle popped open. A figure stepped out, tall and imposing, dressed in military-grade armor. Ethan's heart raced. This wasn't a miner. This was a soldier. Zara, Ethan muttered under his breath. She was the last person he wanted to see. Zara had always been a problem. A thorn in his side. She worked for the same company, and her job was to enforce their rules. She didn't care about the work Ethan did or the people who were left to die on planets like Andorian. To her, it was all about the bottom line. Liora shifted, her eyes locking onto the soldier, and Ethan saw her muscles tense again. She was ready to fight. Stay down, Ethan repeated, more forcefully this time. But before he could move, Zara spoke. I know you're in there, Ethan, she called out, her voice carrying across the desert wind. Come out. Now. Ethan glanced back at Liora, whose eyes were wide, pupils shifting with an almost electric intensity. She understood the danger. But could she help him now? He had no choice but to face her. All right, Ethan muttered, preparing himself for the confrontation. Let's see what she wants. Ethan took a deep breath, his hand gripping the rifle tightly as he moved toward the rover's entrance. He could feel Liora's eyes on him, her gaze unwavering, her body still, but he didn't have time to explain. Zara's voice echoed again, sharper this time, cutting through the tension in the air. Don't make me come in there, Ethan. I know you're hiding something. Ethan cursed under his breath. She was persistent. And stubborn. That was never a good combination. He stepped out of the rover, his boots crunching against the red dust beneath. His pulse quickened, the heat of the planet pressing down on him, making everything feel even more suffocating. Zara stood a few meters away, her posture rigid, but there was something more behind her eyes, something dark, dangerous. You don't belong here, Zara said, her tone colder than the desert nights. This place is off limits for your kind. You're supposed to be fixing the damn grid, not getting involved in whatever this is. Ethan met her gaze, his jaw tightening. He didn't have to explain himself to her. She didn't care about the truth, about what was really happening on Andorian. All she cared about was keeping the company's interests intact, no matter the cost. He glanced back at the rover, his mind racing. Liora was still inside, hidden from Zara's view, but he couldn't shake the feeling that everything was about to change. One wrong move, and he could lose everything. "Let's not do this, Zara," Ethan said, keeping his voice calm. "I'm just here to do my job." "Your job?" She laughed, the sound cold and humorless. "You think I believe that? You've been here too long, Ethan. Way too long. It's time to pack up and go. Now." Zara took a step forward, her boots sinking slightly into the sand, her armored suit glinting under the twin suns. She wasn't backing down, and Ethan knew he couldn't afford to either. "Why don't you just leave, Zara?" Ethan snapped, his voice rising for the first time. "You know as well as I do that the real problem isn't me, it's the company. You're just a tool in their game. And I'm not playing anymore." Zara's face hardened. Her hand moved to the side, reaching for something at her waist, a weapon, no doubt. Ethan's heart skipped a beat. The last thing he needed was a confrontation with her. He had enough problems to deal with already. Before she could fully draw the weapon, the sound of a distant explosion rocked the air. A low, rumbling shake, like thunder, rattled through the ground beneath their feet. Both Ethan and Zara froze. For a moment, the world seemed to stop. Then, without warning, a blast of sand and debris shot into the air from the far side of the canyon. The blast was followed by a screeching, metallic sound, a ship, or something worse, descending quickly. It was a sudden, unrelenting force, like nature itself had chosen this moment to strike. Ethan's instincts kicked in. "Get down," he shouted, pushing Zara to the ground. The two of them dove for cover behind a nearby rock formation as the sky above them seemed to split open. The explosion had torn apart the already fragile atmosphere above Andorion, and now someone was coming for them. Ethan scrambled to his feet, his rifle raised, scanning the skies. Another explosion, louder this time, followed by the unmistakable screech of engines. It was too fast. Too close. "Who the hell are they?" Zara gasped, her voice filled with both anger and fear. Ethan didn't answer. He didn't need to. The answer was clear. Whoever was coming wasn't just a random mining crew. This was something much worse. He moved quickly, his heart pounding in his chest. The distant sound of approaching jets filled the air, and with it, the overwhelming feeling that their time on Andorion was running out. He could feel the pressure building, the tension tightening in the air. "Stay down," Ethan commanded, his voice low and sharp. "We need to find shelter." But Zara didn't listen. Her eyes were fixed on the sky, her face set in determination. "This is your mess, Ethan. You're the one who's been hiding something, hiding her," she spat, glaring at him. "And now look what's happened." Before Ethan could respond, a sharp crack split the air, followed by the deafening roar of engines. The source was now in plain sight, a massive ship, its hull gleaming in the sunlight, came hurtling toward them. The sight was both awe-inspiring and terrifying, its weapons systems clearly visible, locked onto the ground. Zara's eyes widened in realization. "It's them. They're here." Ethan's blood ran cold. He knew exactly who they were. The corporate enforcers. They'd been sent to clean up. But the question remained, why were they after Liora? What was so dangerous about her that they would risk everything to come to Andorion? Zara, her face pale, turned to Ethan. "You have to tell me everything. Now." Before he could respond, the ground trembled again. The ship was almost overhead now, and the wind kicked up in a fierce gust, throwing sand and dust into their faces. Ethan could feel the adrenaline rush through his veins. This wasn't just about survival anymore. This was war. Zara had no idea what she had just stepped into. Neither did Ethan. But one thing was certain: they had to fight, or lose everything. The roar of the engines grew louder, shaking the ground beneath their feet. Ethan's eyes flicked up, the massive ship now hovering just above them. Its sleek, military design gleamed in the harsh sunlight, casting long shadows over the barren landscape. This wasn't just any corporate transport. This was an enforcer vessel. A weaponized ship sent to handle problems. Problems like Liora. Zara was on her feet now, her weapon drawn, eyes scanning the horizon. "They're coming," she hissed through gritted teeth. "We can't outrun them." Ethan's heart raced. He could feel the sweat trickling down his back as he thought fast. They had no cover, no way to fight back. The enforcer ship had weapons that could level a small city. A direct confrontation was suicide. "We don't have to outrun them," Ethan said, his voice steady despite the tension. "We just need to disappear." He turned to Zara. "You want to stay alive? You follow me?" "No questions." Zara's eyes narrowed, but she nodded. The fear was palpable in her expression, but so was something else: resolve. They ran. The ground shook again, the enforcer ship descending in a spiral, landing with a force that sent a shockwave through the canyon. Ethan's pulse thudded in his ears, but he didn't stop. Liora was still inside the rover. She was their only chance. As they sprinted toward the rover, the dust swirling around them, Ethan's mind raced. Liora had to be the key. Whatever the company wanted from her, he had to get her to safety. And if that meant risking everything, so be it. When they reached the rover, Ethan slammed his hand against the hatch. It slid open, revealing Liora, her eyes wide, already on alert. "They're here," Ethan said, breathless. "We need to move. Now." Liora nodded, her expression unreadable. She didn't ask questions. She just moved. Her movements were fluid, graceful, as if she had already understood the urgency of the situation. Ethan and Zara helped Liora into the rover, and without a second thought, Ethan jumped into the driver's seat, slamming the controls into gear. The rover jerked forward, its tires grinding against the rocky terrain. Behind them, the enforcer ship had landed. Ethan could see armed soldiers emerging from the hatch, their black armor shining in the sunlight. They were coming. Fast. He pushed the rover to its limits, the engine whining in protest as they sped across the canyon. The path ahead was treacherous rocky outcrops, jagged cliffs, and shifting dunes that threatened to swallow them whole. "Where are we going?" Zara shouted, her voice barely audible over the roar of the engine. "North Basin," Ethan replied, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. "There's an old supply outpost there. It's off the grid. No one will find us." But even as he spoke, he knew the odds were against them. The enforcers were faster, better equipped, and they had no reason to show mercy. He had to outsmart them, somehow. The wind howled through the open spaces, the roar of the enforcer ship still behind them. It wasn't just the engines that made the sound so terrifying. It was the knowledge that they were being hunted. "How do you know the outpost is still operational?" Zara asked, her voice tinged with disbelief. Ethan glanced at her, a wry smile tugging at his lips. "I used to check on it. It's abandoned, but it's the last place anyone would think to look." "Let's hope you're right," she said, tightening her grip on the rifle. "Because if they catch us, we're done for." The landscape blurred as they sped through the desert, each turn, each bump, making the rover jolt wildly. Ethan's eyes flicked to the rearview mirror, but he couldn't see anything yet. The dust storm from the ship's landing had obscured their pursuers, but that wouldn't last long. They needed to get to the outpost before they were caught. The minutes stretched into what felt like hours as they raced through the barren wasteland. Ethan's heart hammered in his chest. Every second counted. "Get ready," he muttered under his breath. They were getting close to the North Basin. The land ahead began to change. The jagged cliffs softened, the dry riverbeds growing wider, the air cooler. It was only a matter of time before they were out of range, or in even greater danger. As they crested a ridge, Ethan saw it, the supply outpost, just ahead. It was half buried in the sand, its rusted walls barely visible against the shifting dunes. The place was practically forgotten. But that's exactly what they needed. "Almost there," Ethan said, his voice tense with anticipation. But just as they neared the outpost, a blinding light flashed in the distance. The enforcer ship had found them. "Brace for impact," Ethan yelled. The enforcer ship was almost on top of them. Ethan's hands tightened around the steering wheel as the rover jolted over the uneven terrain, barely staying on course. His mind raced, calculating the distance between them and the outpost, hoping they could make it in time. His pulse was a constant drum in his ears, drowning out the roar of the engine and the wind howling through the open spaces. "Hold on," he shouted to Zara and Liora. Behind them, the enforcer ship hovered menacingly. Its guns glinted in the harsh sun, and Ethan knew that it wouldn't hesitate to fire. They were closing in on the outpost, but they weren't going to get there fast enough if the ship opened fire. Zara was clutching the rifle, her knuckles white. "How far?" she yelled, her eyes darting between Ethan and the approaching ship. "Just a minute," Ethan called back, his voice strained with frustration. He could hear the loud hum of the enforcer ship's engines, their target locked. He glanced up in the rearview mirror, seeing the ship's large silhouette growing closer. The sand around them was swirling, the dust kicked up by the ship's thrusters making it harder to see. He could barely make out the shape of the outpost through the haze. But there was something else too, a dark shape moving on the horizon. The enforcer ship dropped lower, and the first warning shot rang out loud and sharp. It struck the ground just behind them, sending a spray of dirt and rocks into the air. Ethan slammed on the accelerator, his heart pounding in his chest. "We're not gonna make it," Zara yelled, panic rising in her voice. "We will," Ethan ground out, "we just have to reach the outpost." The dusty landscape stretched out before them, but the terrain was treacherous, rocky, uneven, with barely any cover. The outpost was just ahead, barely visible, its metal skeleton half buried in the sand. There were no guarantees they would be safe even when they reached it, but it was their only chance. Another shot from the ship, this one closer. The rover's rear panel exploded with sparks, a jolt of electricity traveling through the vehicle. The engine sputtered and groaned, the sound making Ethan's stomach drop. "Come on," he muttered, slamming the accelerator again. The rover surged forward, but the engine was losing power, its strength draining away. Liora's eyes narrowed, her silver pupils shifting with a strange intensity. She raised a hand, her fingers twitching as if she were reaching out to the very air around them. The air seemed to hum with energy, crackling as if it were alive. "Ethan!" Zara shouted, her voice sharp. "What is she doing?" But Ethan was too distracted. He could feel the pull of something powerful in the air, a strange, unseen force that seemed to be emanating from Liora. Her body glowed faintly, a soft, ethereal light emanating from her skin. Her hand twitched again. "Hold on!" Ethan shouted, barely having time to brace himself. Suddenly, a blast of energy shot from Liora's palm, a shock wave that seemed to ripple through the very fabric of space. It hit the Enforcer ship with a violent force, knocking it back and sending a shock wave through the canyon. The ship stalled mid-air, its engines sputtering as it was pushed away. The rover jolted forward, now with an unexpected surge of speed, as if the energy from Liora had given it a boost. Ethan glanced at her, his mouth dry, heart racing. You just did that?" he asked, awe creeping into his voice. Liora's eyes met his, and for a brief moment, there was understanding between them. She didn't speak, but the look in her eyes told him everything he needed to know. "You saved us," Ethan whispered. But there was no time to process the shock. The Enforcer ship was recovering, its thrusters flaring to life again, and it was coming for them. It wouldn't be long before they were back in range, and the next shot might not miss. "Get to the outpost!" Ethan yelled, pushing the rover forward, his hands shaking as he maneuvered it toward the metal skeleton of the abandoned structure. The walls of the outpost grew larger, looming ahead. As they reached the entrance, Ethan slammed on the brakes, sending the rover sliding to a stop inside the broken-down facility. The sand outside kicked up violently, and Ethan quickly jumped out, pulling Liora and Zara behind him. "Get inside," he ordered. They rushed into the shelter of the outpost, the heavy metal doors creaking shut behind them. Inside, the outpost was dark and abandoned, only a few flickering lights cast long shadows across the cracked concrete floors. The air was thick with dust, and the smell of stale metal filled their nostrils. Zara glanced at Ethan, her eyes wide with disbelief. "How long do you think we'll last here?" she asked, her voice strained with exhaustion and fear. Ethan wiped the sweat from his forehead, taking a deep breath. "Not long. We need to make this quick. Liora, can you help us get the power back on? We need to send a signal." Liora stood still for a moment, her gaze moving around the darkened room. She nodded slightly, her body glowing faintly as she stepped forward. There was something almost serene in her movements, as though she was familiar with this kind of place. As though she had been here before. The walls seemed to hum, a faint energy building in the air around them as Liora placed her hands on the nearest control panel. Her eyes closed, and the temperature in the room shifted. For a moment, the air was cold, and then the lights flickered to life, bathing the room in a soft, dim glow. Ethan's breath caught. The signal would work. They were going to survive. But just as hope flickered in his chest, the sound of engines roared again. The Enforcer ship was closing in fast. They wouldn't have long. "We have to move now," Ethan said, his voice low but urgent. The distant rumble of the Enforcer ship grew louder. It wasn't just the engines, it was the unmistakable sound of its weapons powering up, the low hum vibrating through the walls of the outpost. Ethan's heart raced as he turned toward Zara and Liora, who were both still in the shadowy corner of the room, waiting for him. "We need to move," Ethan said, his voice urgent, but not panicked. He didn't have time for panic. The walls of the outpost might protect them for a moment, but it wouldn't be long before the Enforcers found their way in. Liora moved first. She seemed to glide across the room, her green hair shifting like the reflection of light on water. There was something otherworldly about her, the way her presence filled the room despite her stillness. Ethan couldn't take his eyes off her, not out of fear, but awe. She was a force to be reckoned with. "What are you doing?" Zara asked, her voice tight with suspicion as she eyed Liora. Liora's silver eyes flicked toward Zara, almost unreadable. She didn't speak. Instead, her hand reached out to touch a control panel, her fingers brushing against the surface. The lights flickered again, and then the screen on the control panel blinked to life. A low hum filled the room, the machinery inside the outpost slowly awakening. Ethan felt the power of the building pulse back to life, a soft glow emanating from Liora's hand. "She's trying to send a signal," Ethan said, his voice quieter than before. "Get ready." Zara scowled. "Send a signal? To who? We're sitting ducks in here." Ethan didn't answer her. He didn't have time to argue. The sound of the ship's engines whined again, much closer now. The enforcers were relentless, and it was only a matter of time before they made their move. Suddenly, the ground trembled beneath their feet. "Ethan, what the hell is that?" Zara asked, her voice sharp. Liora's head turned sharply toward the door, and then, for the first time, Ethan saw it, a faint glow from beneath the outpost, creeping through the cracks in the floor. It wasn't the glow of the signal. It was something else. The hum of machinery inside the walls grew louder, and the ground shook again, this time more violently. The control panel beeped urgently, flashing red. Ethan's eyes went wide. "Get back," he shouted, grabbing Zara's arm and pulling her away from the panel. Before they could react, the floor beneath them gave way. A loud, ear-splitting crash echoed through the room, and the three of them were plunged into darkness. The ground shifted, the walls collapsing in on themselves. Ethan's heart was pounding as he scrambled to hold onto something solid. Liora remained calm, her body glowing faintly in the darkness. She was the only one who wasn't struggling. Her eyes gleamed as she lifted her hand, a soft, powerful pulse of energy emanating from her body, stabilizing the room around them. "What the hell is going on?" Zara demanded, her voice laced with panic. "Is this part of your plan, Liora?" Liora didn't respond. She didn't need to. Her eyes locked with Ethan's for a moment, and there was a deep, unspoken understanding between them. Whatever this was, it wasn't an accident. It was part of the bigger picture, the key to surviving whatever was coming next. As the dust settled, Ethan glanced around. The outpost's control center was now completely destroyed, but in the wreckage, there was something else, something darker. An underground passage, hidden beneath the floor, had been exposed in the collapse. "We're not going to make it out of here, are we?" Zara asked, her voice low, resigned. Ethan turned to face her. He could see the doubt in her eyes. But there was no time for fear, no time for uncertainty. The enforcers were closing in. They had no choice. "No," Ethan replied, his voice steady, "we're not. But we can't give up. We fight until the end." Liora stepped forward, her hand outstretched. Her energy crackled in the air, and the passageway began to glow, illuminating the path ahead. It was as if the very walls of the outpost were bending to her will. "We go through," Ethan said, turning to Zara. "Now." Without waiting for a response, he led the way. The ground beneath them felt unstable, but they had no other option. The passage was narrow, twisting through dark, forgotten tunnels. As they moved deeper, the distant sound of the enforcer ship's engines was muffled, but still there. It was only a matter of time before they found a way in. Liora's presence ahead of him was like a guiding light in the darkness, her energy resonating in the silence. Ethan followed closely, Zara at his back, each step heavier than the last. But they kept moving. The air grew colder as they descended further into the depths. Ethan felt his breath catch in his throat as they approached a massive, underground chamber. The walls were lined with strange markings, alien symbols that seemed to pulse with energy. This was no ordinary outpost. They had uncovered something far bigger. Liora's gaze swept across the room, her expression unreadable. She raised her hand again, and the chamber's center began to glow brightly. Ethan's heart skipped a beat. What had they stumbled upon? And why did it feel so alive? A soft, melodic hum filled the chamber, the sound of Liora's energy mixing with the vibrations in the walls. The room seemed to come alive in response. The symbols on the walls shifted, changing, glowing with an otherworldly power. "We need to go," Zara said, her voice tight with fear. This is beyond anything I've ever seen." But Liora wasn't listening. She was already stepping forward, her hand reaching for something in the center of the room. A massive pulse of energy exploded from the chamber, shaking the very foundation of the outpost. "We're too late," Ethan muttered under his breath. Suddenly, a crackling voice broke through the air, faint but clear. "Ethan. Liora, you have been found." The chamber was alive with energy. The walls hummed with the vibrations of something ancient, something powerful. Ethan stood still, his breath shallow as he watched Liora move through the room, her figure bathed in the soft, pulsing glow that seemed to emanate from the very heart of the chamber. It was as though she belonged here. Like the planet was calling to her. He swallowed hard, trying to ignore the tightness in his chest. He couldn't explain it, this pull he felt toward her. It was something more than just curiosity. Something deeper, more primal. His body was reacting to her presence in ways he couldn't control. Liora stopped in front of the glowing symbols, her fingers brushing lightly against the alien markings etched into the stone. A soft light flickered from her touch, and for a moment, the room felt like it was breathing. As if the very walls were alive with the same energy she controlled. "Ethan," she whispered, her voice low, almost hesitant. She turned to face him, her silver eyes meeting his. There was an intensity in her gaze, one that made his pulse quicken. She was no longer just an alien, she was real, tangible. She was here, with him, in this impossible situation. And somehow, that made everything feel even more surreal. Ethan took a slow step forward, drawn to her. The distance between them seemed to shrink with each passing second, the hum of the room, the thrum of the energy, filling his ears. The chaos outside, the threat of the Enforcer's ship, seemed miles away. All that mattered was the way Liora was looking at him, like she was waiting for something. Waiting for him. He closed the gap between them, and for a moment, they stood there, mere inches apart. Liora's breath was soft, shallow, as if she were waiting for him to make the first move. Are you real?" Ethan's voice cracked, betraying the uncertainty that had been building inside him. Liora's lips parted slightly, a faint smile tugging at the corners of her mouth. It was a small gesture, but it sent a jolt through him. She reached out slowly, her hand brushing his arm, the warmth of her skin making his heart race. "Yes," she said softly. Her voice was like a melody, resonating in his mind. "I am real." Ethan's breath caught in his throat. It was as though she had just answered the question he hadn't even known he needed to ask. In that moment, everything else faded away. The conflict, the danger, the isolation, they all seemed so distant, so irrelevant. All that mattered was the connection between them. His hand reached for hers, and when their fingers touched, it was like an electric shock that surged through both of them. Liora didn't flinch. She didn't pull away. Instead, she gripped his hand tighter, as if grounding herself in the touch. Slowly, carefully, she closed the distance between them, her other hand rising to rest on his chest, just above his heart. Ethan could feel the warmth of her body through his suit, the soft pressure of her touch against him. Her skin was like nothing he had ever felt, smooth, cool, almost otherworldly. And yet, it was warm, alive. Her energy seemed to pulse in rhythm with his heartbeat. He didn't know who moved first. All he knew was that, in a moment of pure instinct, their lips met. The kiss was gentle at first, tentative, like two souls brushing against each other. But as their bodies instinctively pressed closer, the kiss deepened. There was no hesitation now, just an undeniable pull, a force that neither of them could resist. Ethan's hands moved to her back, pulling her closer, his fingers splayed against the smooth, cool fabric of her suit. Liora's hand slid up to the back of his neck, pulling him in closer still. Their bodies aligned perfectly, the heat of their touch blending together as they shared a quiet, intimate moment in the midst of chaos. The world outside the threat of the Enforcer's ship, the desolation of Andorian, felt so far away, as though they were suspended in their own universe. For a brief, fleeting moment, everything felt perfect. Then, just as quickly, the world came rushing back. Liora pulled away first, her eyes searching his with a mixture of wonder and something darker, something deeper. She was breathing heavily, her chest rising and falling as though she, too, were caught in the intensity of the moment. Ethan stepped back, trying to regain his composure. The reality of their situation hit him like a wave, but the connection he felt to Liora wasn't something he could ignore. The kiss had been an acknowledgement, not just of desire, but of something far more profound. "We don't have time," Ethan said, his voice strained. "The Enforcers?" Liora nodded, her expression shifting, as if the moment they shared had never happened. Her hand brushed against his one last time, her touch lingering as if to say, "We'll finish this later." Ethan turned toward the exit of the chamber, his mind still racing from what had just transpired. He could feel the heat of Liora's presence, the weight of the kiss still burning in his chest. He couldn't deny it anymore. They were in this together. For better or worse. "Let's go," Ethan said, his voice steady once more. "We need to get out of here." Liora didn't hesitate. She followed him without a word, her eyes focused, her presence still as powerful as ever. But Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that this moment between them was only the beginning. The harsh winds of Andorian whipped against their faces as they ran, the vast desert stretching endlessly before them. The Enforcer ship was still overhead, its shadow flickering across the sand. But it was fading, growing smaller with each step they took. Ethan knew that this wouldn't last forever. They couldn't outrun them for long, but they had gained a crucial head start. Ethan's breath came in sharp gasps as he pushed forward, keeping a firm grip on Liora's hand. The connection between them, the bond that had deepened with every passing moment, felt unbreakable now. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew that he wasn't facing it alone. Zara, though quiet, was moving with the same fierce determination. She kept scanning the horizon, her eyes never resting, always alert. Ethan could see the weight of the situation in her eyes, but she didn't flinch. She was in this just as much as they were. The sun was beginning to set, casting an eerie orange glow across the desert, the air cooling slightly. Ethan could feel the exhaustion settling in, but they couldn't stop. Not yet. They needed to reach the outpost they had planned for, an abandoned facility that, if they were lucky, would provide temporary shelter. Ethan's eyes flicked to Liora. Her silver eyes were sharp, focused, and there was a quiet strength about her that had kept them all going. As they ran side by side, he felt something shift between them, a deeper understanding. This wasn't just survival anymore. This was something else. They were choosing each other. They were choosing life. The old mining outpost appeared in the distance, barely visible against the setting sun. It was crumbling, forgotten by time, but it would provide them with the time they needed. They had to get there. Almost there, Ethan called over his shoulder, his voice strained. Liora nodded, squeezing his hand tighter. "We'll make it," she said, her voice steady, unwavering. But as they neared the outpost, the unmistakable sound of engines roared in the distance. The Enforcer ship had picked up their trail again. It wasn't over. Not yet. Ethan's heart skipped a beat, but he didn't slow down. He couldn't afford to. "Zara, we need to get inside now." Zara pushed forward, her pace quickening. They reached the outpost, and Ethan slammed the door open. They rushed inside, and the sound of the door sealing shut echoed in the small, empty space. The walls were cold and cracked, the remnants of an old mining facility long abandoned, but it was enough. Ethan quickly scanned the room. There was a small control panel in the corner, barely functional, but it was worth a shot. If they could get the power on, they might be able to send one final signal to the outside world. Liora stepped forward, her fingers brushing over the control panel. As she did, a faint light flickered to life. The energy in the room shifted, and Ethan felt a surge of hope. Maybe this was their moment. "I'll make it quick," Liora said, her voice calm despite the chaos. She closed her eyes for a moment, her energy gathering around her, and then the panel began to hum, slowly coming to life. Outside, the Enforcer ship hovered closer, its engines cutting through the air like a predator waiting for the kill. The time was running out. Ethan approached Liora, standing beside her. He didn't know what would happen next. The signal might not get through. The Enforcers might find them. But right here, in this moment, they were together. They had fought for this. They had chosen each other. He placed his hand gently on her shoulder, a silent reassurance. She looked up at him, her silver eyes reflecting the soft glow from the control panel. For a moment, everything else faded. The desert, the Enforcers, the danger, it all seemed distant. "Ethan," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "I never wanted to be just a survivor. I wanted to be more. And you gave me that." Her words hit him like a wave, overwhelming him in the best possible way. He didn't need any more explanations. He understood. She wasn't just running anymore. Neither was he. "I'm not letting you go," he whispered back. "Not now. Not ever." Just as the control panel emitted a final beep, the door to the outpost suddenly slammed open. The Enforcers were there. "Get down!" Zara shouted as gunfire erupted through the doorway. Without thinking, Ethan grabbed Liora's arm and pulled her close, shielding her as best he could. The sound of bullets ricocheted off the walls, but Zara was already returning fire, buying them precious seconds. But it was too late. The Enforcers had breached the door, and their guns were trained on them. "We've got you now," one of the soldiers snarled, stepping forward. Ethan's mind raced. There was no way out. No time to fight. But then, Liora stepped forward, her body glowing with that same ethereal energy. Her eyes locked onto the soldier, her gaze intense, full of purpose. With a swift motion, she raised her hand, and the energy in the room surged. The enforcer soldiers froze, their movements halting as if they were caught in an invisible grip. The air crackled with power. Ethan watched in awe as Liora's energy swirled around them, a wave of force pushing the soldiers back, knocking them off their feet. The enforcers stumbled, disoriented, their weapons dropping to the floor. Liora turned to Ethan, her expression calm, but there was something more in her eyes. Something final. "Let's go," she said, her voice steady. Ethan nodded. The enforcers were temporarily subdued, but they had no time to waste. "Thank you," Ethan said quietly, his eyes never leaving her face. They rushed past the fallen soldiers, out into the desert again, the night settling around them. The stars above were clear, almost unreal in their brilliance. The worst was over, but the real fight was just beginning. They would find a way. Together. And as they walked into the unknown, with the distant sound of the enforcer ship's engine slowly fading away, Ethan realized something. This journey, this strange, painful, beautiful journey had led them to something more than survival. It had led them to each other. In the final moments, when the universe itself seemed to pause, I realized something: love is not bound by anything. Not by space. Not by time. Not even by the people you thought you were meant to be with. The enforcers are gone now. The battle is over. But what really won wasn't the war. It was the bond we formed. And as I stand here with her, I realize the impossible truth: sometimes the things we cannot understand are the very things we're meant to love. We fought, we ran, and we survived. But what happens now? The stars are still out there shining, beckoning us forward. But the question is, will love survive the universe's rules? Can love exist across worlds, against all odds? Or is it just a beautiful fantasy that we chase in the darkness? The answer is still out there, beyond the stars, and maybe, just maybe, it's closer than we think. But don't just take my word for it. Comment below, let me know what you think. What would you do if love came from the stars? And if you're as curious about what happens next, subscribe to Intergalactic Hearts. You're one of the first 1,000 to join this journey. And trust me, you don't want to miss what comes next.